Today, we're very honored to have a very special guest here, Andrew Schot, who will be speaking about his experiences during a unique and rather terrible period in world history. Just to set the context for what he's going to talk about, back on March 10th, the 8 million civilians living in Holland had their lives horribly changed when the Germans invaded Holland. This was an unnecessary attack in that the Netherlands were a neutral country, but Hitler was who he was, right? So from there on, there was about a 5-day battle. The Netherlands surrendered, and life for the Dutch civilians changed for the next 5 years. The lives of the Jewish community in the Netherlands was to change the most. As a matter of fact, by 5 years later, at the end of the war, 70% of that community was gone. You may wonder why we're having Andrew present today at a museum that is all about honoring the memory of a group of Air Force flyers from World War II, the 390th Bomb Group. We are the 390th Memorial Museum because we are a memorial to those flyers. Why were they flying? They were flying to take down the Third Reich that was doing not only in the Netherlands what it was doing, but across Europe, into Russia, North Africa, across the Mediterranean, so forth. That was why the 390th Bomb Group existed. And to me, it seems very appropriate to have presenters talking about what was it like on the ground as a civilian during the war, as our men were in the air trying to bring an end to the Third Reich. Andrew Schot was a young boy in Holland when the Nazis invaded, and I'm not going to steal his thunder by telling you his story, but I would ask all of you to please welcome him to the museum now.
Thank you. Am I wired, Jed? Something he failed to say. When I came in here, I didn't know there was a purpose for those 2 machine guns at the end of the aisle here. But I found out that was in case somebody steps in the aisle during the participation. Well, my name is Andrew Schot, and I'm a 93-year-old man, and I was born and raised in the Netherlands, and I was 9 years old when the war started, and I was just a kid, fed, going, happy, and we were impressed as kids because those Germans marched in. They said they had a 5-day war. Actually, what it was is it took 5 days for the Germans to totally occupy Holland. There was not much of a war going on. The Dutch were neutral, so they didn't have much of a military. I know our mobile forces, and you remember that, they were soldiers on bicycles. You know, when the Germans came in, tanks and airplanes and stuff like that. But anyway, we were impressed. You know, I had never seen a piece of artillery or anything like that. And in Holland, we didn't have blacktop streets because of the weather there that wouldn't last at all. So they had cobblestone streets. And the German soldiers now wore studded boots, metal studded boots. And when they marched down those cobblestone streets, that sound was just thundering, you know. And that impressed us little kids. Well, I didn't know, even at the time, I had no idea that I had any Jewish connection. But the Germans didn't have the same laws at that time the Jewish community had, which was, you are what your mother was. If your mother was Jewish, you're Jewish. If your mother was a Gentile, you were a Gentile. My mom was a Gentile. My dad was a Jew. Uh, I knew I had aunts and uncles that were Jews because they attended the synagogue, and I thought that's what it meant to be a Jew. I strictly looked at it as a religion. Although on my mom's side, her dad was Jewish, but her mom was a Gentile. Well, the Nuremberg law that the Germans went by strictly just said that you have 3 or more Jewish grandparents, you're a full-blooded Jew. If you had 2 of Jewish grandparents, you were a Misslinger, which is a mixed blood of the first degree. If you had only 1 Jewish grandparent, you were a Misslinger. But so I did not consider myself a Jew, and that went fine until it started. And then the first thing that happened to our family during the war is the Germans conducted what became known as the first razzia. They took trucks through the streets and they rounded up all the Jewish men of working age. And they advertised that the reason they had to do it, they needed workers in the factories in Germany because all the German men were in the military. Well, people said, well, how did they know they were Jews? Well, at the time in Holland, you didn't see very many black-haired people. The common Jew, the common Dutchman was either blonde or redhead. So if they just rounded up all the black-haired men of that age, they took them to a place, and if you could prove that you were not a Jew, they'd let you go. But we didn't have very many people there with black hair that were not Jews. So, and the way that affected my family is I had an older brother who was 7 years older than me, who was caught up in that razzia. And he ended up at Auschwitz concentration camp. It wasn't long after that we found out that what they were telling us about factory workers was a lie, that those people that were rounded up went to concentration camps. Well, then things got more involved. The next thing I know, they put all of the stores closed to Jews and all other places of entertainment, theaters, swimming pools, city parks, all have signs and put on them, off limits to Jews. And so they did with the grocery stores. Now, we didn't have stores like Safeway and stuff like that. We only had mom and pop stores. And what they did, they put them off limits, but in each neighborhood, they allowed one store to close up 1 day a week at normal time, and then open up again and sell to Jews, because Jews were still allowed to eat. And I remember that very well, because the first time that happened in our neighborhood, the store to sell to Jews was opened up for business for Jews on Wednesday. And Mom took me to that store the first day that it opened, and we went there and it had a sign in the window, and it says, no Jews allowed when humans are on the premises. And I looked at that, and Mom looked at that, and she never took me to the store again. That was a real shocker. But that became the whole situation. And things went from bad to worse. And then the next big thing that happened is I went to school one day, and the teacher handed me an envelope and told me to take it home and give it to Mom. Well, that happened before, and when I normally talk to kids, I tell them, and we did things that you wouldn't do, and you do things we wouldn't do, but when the teacher gives an envelope to take home to Mom, that envelope always came open on the way home. And it was easy. In those days, the envelopes, the glue on it wasn't very good, so you just took your little pocket knife, wet it a little bit, and opened it up. When I opened it up, there was a piece of cloth in there with 2 stars on it, and the Jewish star, and the word Jew in Dutch, which is Jod, and the note said that I was to wear one of those on my left outer garment breast from that day forward, and failure to do so was punishable by death. Well, I was just a kid, and that really kind of knocked me on my heels. But nevertheless, I closed the envelope back up, took it home to Mom, and acted surprised when she opened it up. And Mom started crying. You got to remember, my mom was an adult during World War One, so she knew what war was all about and what was about to come. But nevertheless, she put one on my little jacket, and I wore it to school the following day. And in the class, I know there was one other person. We had a class of, I don't remember, 25, something like people. And a little girl, a little black-haired girl, wore the star too. She didn't survive. But I know we had a class bully. I don't think they use them anymore, but that was usually a guy that had more brawn than brain. And he came to me and he says, "Where can I get one of those stars?" Well, he learned in a hurry that he really didn't want one. But anyway, that star just totally knocked you out of most places you could go. You could no longer go on the trains. You were restricted in travel. And but I wore the star, and then things still kept getting worse. The next individual got hurt by it is, they started rounding up people. And so my dad, is anybody familiar with the story of Anne Frank? Okay. There's a time frame about 5 months to 6 months before the Franks got the notice for their oldest daughter to go to the railroad station. My dad got that notice, and he was to report to the railroad station for what they call relocation. Well, by now he knew what was going on, so he decided he wasn't going to go. He said, "They already got one of my sons, one of my daughters. I'm not going to go." The other daughter they had, she was not in Holland. She was an interpreter. She was much older than me, and she had been out of the country in France on an assignment. And we had hoped that the British company that had hired her for that had taken her with the people back to England, but they didn't. And anyway, he decided to go underground. That means going into hiding. But by that time, there was no organization to help him at all. So he disappeared, but he'd come home on weekends to have dinner with the family. So that only lasted about 2 or 3 weeks, and then one afternoon, on Sunday afternoon, after dinner, I went out to play with my friends, and 3 German soldiers showed up, big guys, wore those big heavy uniform and the breastplate with Sicherheitspolizei. That means, and they had submachine guns, and they came to the house, and I watched them go in. And when they came out, they had my dad with them. So I went over there to try to talk to them, but they wouldn't let me near him. And as I stood there, they marched him down the street, and he looked so vulnerable because my dad was not a very big man, maybe 5'8", and 140 pounds. He was a gymnastic teacher. And these guys were big and heavy, and they surrounded him, one on each side and one in front of him. And they marched him down the street, and I was 11, I had just turned 11 years old, and that was the last time I saw my dad. He ended up at Bergen-Belsen. So not long after that, Mom decided what was left is I had another sister that was 6 years older than me, and myself and Mom, and by then we were living with Grandma. So Mom got my sister and me together. She said, this is getting worse. He said, it's time for us to go into hiding. Well, she had it all planned. On Wednesday afternoon, she took shopping bags and put necessities in there, and we went outside. She didn't tell me or my sister where we were going, but we carried those bags, and that was smart because people saw us with those bags. They knew we had been to the Jewish store. If you had carried a suitcase, they knew you were going somewhere. And she just took us down the street. There was an old canal house. When you saw the picture of the Anne Frank, where his place of business was, my grandma's house was right across the canal from that. In fact, if I stood in front of Grandma's place, I could almost throw a rock through the window on his business. I never did, but the down the street there was a canal house. It was one of the smaller ones, and it was abandoned for as long as I remember. And that's where she took us. And when we went inside, the stairwell going up to the second floor was already tore out. People had tore it out for firewood. So they had a homemade ladder sitting there, and we went up to the attic, and we got there. It had no ceiling, just a tile roof, and some of the tile were missing. And there was no water, no heat, no nothing. And there were already some people, relatives of Mom, were already there. So my sister looked at me, and she said, you know, this is not going to work. Up here, we have to be totally quiet. You know, we have to depend on other people to haul off the waste and bring food and stuff like that. So she talked to Mom, and she said before the war, she had been going to a junior college in northern the province of Friesland to be a gymnastic teacher like that. And but of course, the war, they kicked the Jewish kids out. So she was home, and she said, Friesland is primarily farm country. There's very few towns. There's a capital that maybe had 40,000 people in it. But she said, we can hide there among the farm fields. So Mom allowed her to go, us to go. And she took me to the harbor. And if you look at Holland, the map of Holland, you see that all the big cities are in the southern half of Holland, all the farm countries in the northern part. And they're separated in part by a place called at IJsselmeer, which is a lake named after the IJssel River. Before it was a lake, it was known as the Zuiderzee. And but it caused so many floods, so they built a dike across the top end of it, and they closed it off, and so they could stabilize the water. So she went to the harbor, and they had freighters going across back and forth because they were taking factory goods north and farm products back south. So she talked one of the captains into taking us with him across that lake one night. And my sister, she was a cutie pie, and she was a good talker, and she could talk anybody into anything. So we went across there, and she had it all planned out. When we got there, what we did, in the mornings, we would watch farm hands going out to the fields to work. There were no motorized vehicles, and even if there were, there was no gasoline available. So they went by horse and wagon, and we watched for a wagon with several farm workers in it, and we followed that in the field. And when the farmers worked, we would sit by the wagon. And in Holland, it's very easy to see a long distance because it's kind of flat. And people say there are no mountains in Holland, but that's not totally true. There is a mountain in Holland, in the province of Limburg, and that's 27 feet high. But, if that's all you got, be proud of it. So, but we could see for a long way. And another way is that, especially in that part of Holland, in those farm fields, it's below sea level. So it's always moist, and if you were to build a road, it would just sink in. So what they do, they build up high, and depending on the size of the road, they put the road on top of that embankment. And in most cases, those things were about 10, 11 feet high. And so if you saw a motorized vehicle on one of the roads, we knew they were Germans because the only ones that had them and the only one that had gasoline. And we would start acting like we were putting things in the wagon or taking things out of the wagon so they wouldn't give us a second look. So that worked fine. Our most dangerous part of the day was at night when the farm hands went back to the farm. Well, fortunately, there were no phones. So if one of those hands after dinner decided to go on the bicycle and go to town and report the Jews on the farm, we'd be in trouble. So what we did, we stayed in the field. We didn't follow the workers back to the farmland. We stayed in the field, and there were some haystacks and stuff like that, and we'd hide behind it. And when it got dark, we'd leave the area. We would never spend the same 2 days in a row in the same area. We'd leave at night, and then after dark, we try to find a farm, a barn, and the farms there were all the same. They had a barn, and the larger farm, it was a 2-story barn, made out of red brick and a red tile roof. And we find one of those, and we go inside and go up to the second level. On the bottom level, they usually have the horse stalls and the equipment stalls. And on the top, they would store the hay, and when they brought in the harvest of wheat, it stayed up there, and they got ready to thresh it. And so we could sleep in either hay or straw, but was ever available. And then the following morning, we'd start things all over again. Of course, another thing is we had to eat, and we couldn't go to the store and buy food, but we were in farm country, and that was the idea. Well, in the beginning, at night, before we went lay down, we'd go to the farm and go to the vegetable garden and take some items that are there, like carrots, whatever was there. Well, we found out that the farmers didn't appreciate that because they didn't grow those vegetables for the market. They grew them for their own family consumption. And the reason we found out, they started putting a little barbed wire around it. And we couldn't afford to have farmers get mad at us, so we left it alone. But there were plenty of other things. One thing is, my sister, she was totally in charge. She was 6 years older than me. And she said, we need to eat eggs. Well, we couldn't raid the chicken coop because you know what roosters do when you raise the chicken. But the thing is, in Holland, there's one thing opposite to what is here. In the pastures, you see that they're like this. And at the end of each, there is a drainage canal. Here we have those little ditches, to feed water onto the grass. Over there, they're there to allow water to run off. And it gets into those little ditches, and then it is pumped up into canals. And from the canals, it is pumped up to the river, and then it flows to the sea. Now, in the old days, they used windmills for that. Now they use, powered motors. But in those days it was windmills. So they had windmills all over that. And I remember I've only been back once, and we took a tour, and one place there was 3 mills, and one of them was standing there, and it had a Dutch door, open, and the guy in there was selling little Delft blue jars of mustard. And the place was advertised as a mustard mill. And as we sat there and looked at it, we had a car, and these tourist buses would pull up, and they would buy those mustards and stuff. And after a while, I got out when there was an empty space, and I went over to the guy and I said, you know, there is no way that this mill can produce this much mustard. He said, son, he said, this mill hasn't produced any mustard in over 20 years. He said, we buy it from the same place that the stores buy it. And sure enough, the following day, I went to one of the big stores, and there was the same mustard jar, except in the store, it sold for $8. At the mill, it sold for $15. Another thing we ran into, my wife, she was American, you know, she'd never been there. And I told her, I said, you remember the story about the little boy that stuck his finger in the dike? She said, yes. I said, I want to show you something. So we took a ride and we went to at that time, the biggest dike in Holland, the Amsterdam. And we went up there, and on top of the dike is a four-way highway. And it has parking spaces, you know, that you can get out. And we got out there, and we got out of the car, and I told my wife, I said, you have any idea where we're at? I said, no. I said, you're top of the dike, you know. And we took one side, where is the North Sea, and the other side is at IJsselmeer, and the sea level is about 7 or 8 feet different. The lake is lower than the sea. And then I took her into the countryside, and we went one place, they had a dirt dike, and that town was very smart, a small town. They had a statue there by the dike of the little boy that stuck his finger in the dike. And they had a family in traditional Dutch fisherman uniform, the black wool, and they stood there, and the tourist, can I take a picture of my son with you? Sure, $3. They had no taxes. That place, I mean, it was busy as can be, you know. They took the pictures, you know, for the family. And we stood by that dike, and I told my wife, I said, can you imagine during a big storm that somebody could put a finger in the dike to stop? The reason I keep looking at Paula, she's from Holland, and she remembers that, you know, there was no way. In fact, I had never heard that story until after I came to the United States. Did you? Yeah, see, they don't tell that story in Holland because it's strictly fiction. But anyway, we did the same thing, kept another thing we ate. At the time, I didn't know, but they grew an awful lot of sugar beets. And when they harvested them, they stacked them out in the field. And after the war, I researched why so many sugar beets. I didn't know that until I ran into it. They said, well, they grew them. First of all, they sold them to the candy companies because they make sugar out of them. Now, I don't know if you've ever been around sugar beets. When you cut one of them open, they look like an apple without the core. They're sweeter, much sweeter than apples. They make sugar out of it. And they also use them to feed to the pigs and get them ready for slaughter, you know, to fatten up the pigs. So we would take one of those sugar beets and cut it open, and we eat off of that for 3 or 4 days. And then another thing we did is when we bedded down at night in a barn where they had the harvest, the wheats and stuff like that, there were all kernels of wheat laying on the floor, and we'd stuff our pockets full of those. And then during the day when you got hungry, you just reach in and grab a handful, blow the dust out of it, and start chewing. And that's good. I mean, I like the wheat the best. You got to be careful of the rye because those kernels are so hard, you know, you'll break your teeth when you chew on them. And But my wife, my sister decided to eat eggs. Well, when I was talking about those ditches, wild birds nest on the side of those drainage ditches. And so they lay their eggs there. And we would find one that had eggs in it, and we'd take a couple of eggs out of there and eat them. Well, we couldn't fry them, we couldn't boil them or anything, so my sister showed me how to eat raw eggs. Now, I'm always careful with the kids. I tell them, don't try this at home. It's not a good idea. But what you do, you take the egg, and hold it up like that, and you take a ballpoint pen and tap a little hole in it. Now, we didn't use a ballpoint pen, we used a twig. Anybody realize why? Ballpoint pens hadn't been invented yet. But what you do, you tap a little hole in it, and then turn it over, hold a finger over that hole, tap a little bigger hole, and then take it to your mouth, let go of that, and suck, and the egg will come out. Well, of course, we didn't know how old the eggs were. And a couple of times we tapped the hole, and I sucked, and the feathers came out instead of, no. But I remember the first time I did what she told me to do, and I got it here. The stench was just so bad because, you see, those birds that laid those eggs lived on fish. So when you opened that egg, it tasted and smelled like rotten fish. So when I got it here, I about gagged, and my sister said, well, dummy, you're supposed to use the other hand and hold your nose. Well, I tried that, and it didn't work very well. So, but she made me eat at least one a week. And we went, and then we lived like that for a long time. We didn't know what happened to our family and stuff like that, or what was going on. But people said, you know, that sounded like a lot of fun. You know, I wouldn't mind trying that. Well, my sister and I lived like that for about 2 years. And one night, we were looking for a place to sleep, and as usual, it was raining. It was dark, it had been thundering, and we moved through the fields, and all of a sudden, my sister grabbed my arm and squeezed. That was a danger signal. In Holland, being wet and flat, if you say stop or say anything else, you can hear it a long way off. So our silent signal was to squeeze the arm. So she squeezed my arm, and she went over to me. She said, look ahead. There's a highway, a road up there. And she said, we looked at that, and you could see the outline of trucks parked. And at one end of it, the east end towards Germany, there you could see little glows. And then I could hear voices. Evidently, there was a convoy heading for Germany, and they had taken a smoke break. And so I looked at that, and I turned to go the other way. My sister says, I wonder what's in those trucks. I says, I don't care. I just wanted to get out of there. But she was in charge, so we went towards the dike, and we walked through the drainage ditch, and it had about, this much water standing in it. And we climbed up that embankment to the road, and when we got there, I went to the rear end, and she went to the front end. They were typical military trucks with the tarp over the top of it. And I put my hands under the tarp, and I felt around, and I got a hold of something, but I couldn't get it out. The tarp was just too tight, and I kept trying. And then my sister came over. She says, they're breaking up. Let's get out of here. I said, I've got a hold of something, and I can't get it out. So she stepped up beside me, put her foot against the tire, and held the tarp, and I got out what I had. By that time, we could hear footsteps. So we turned around, and dummy us, that embankment we had so carefully climbed up on, we thought we could just walk down. So about the first step we took, both of us went hand over heels and into that drainage ditch. And I thought it was funny, so I raised my head and I started laughing, and my sister didn't think it was funny, so she grabs me behind the head and pushed my head back on the water. And when she let go, I knew to be quiet, and we laid there until the trucks moved out. And then we got out and tried to find a place to sleep. Although not until the following morning we really had a good look at what we got. And what I had was a wheel of cheese. As you see in that was a big wheel of cheese, about that big around. And that was great. We ate off of that for a long time, and we shared with some of the others that we run across there. My sister, on the other hand, had a bag of coffee beans. Useless to us. We were youngsters, didn't drink coffee. We had no way to grind it, and even if we did, we had no place to boil it. So, but my sister, the smart one, she said, not to worry. So the following day, she went up to one of the farmhands and asked to borrow his raincoat. Now, she could have talked him out of the farm, but all she wanted was a raincoat. And he loaned her his raincoat, and she put it on to hide the star. Now, you didn't dare take the star off, because if you took the star off, it was pretty well known. If you were discovered to be a Jew without wearing the star, you were immediately executed. And so she wore the raincoat, and she put that bag of coffee beans underneath. Now, the reason it was coffee beans, coffee didn't grow in Europe anywhere. Coffee beans came from South America, and German submarines hauled it to Europe. And outside there, a place called Harlington, there was a submarine base, and evidently goods that they had brought in, like the coffee beans and stuff, that convoy was hauling to the higher-ups in Germany. So my sister, she got me in the field, and she says, look, I'm going to go to town and trade these coffee beans for something we can use. And I said, okay. She said, now you stay right here. This was right next to a haystack. And she said, don't move until I get back. So she left. And shortly thereafter, fear started in. She had been totally in charge, directing every move we made. What happened if she didn't come back? So I think I lost about 1.5 pounds sitting there all day. But she finally got back, and she started to tell me what she did. And I stopped her dead. I said, let's make one agreement right now. You never do this again. You never leave me again. And she agreed. And she had gone to town and got to one of the schools that had been made into a German Kaserne. And there she went and looked up the steward of the officer's mess. And she told him, she says, look, I have at my disposal about 1.5 pounds of coffee beans. Are you interested in making a trade? Of course he was. He had been able to serve real coffee to guys, to the officers for some time. What they were using is called ersatz. And what they did is they took wheat and roasted the wheat. It didn't taste like coffee. It was terrible stuff. So she came back and she had different things. She had like chunks of bread, not loaves or slices, but just chunks of bread. That was great. And some other stuff, including a lot of pudding powder. And I looked at that and I said, what are we going to do with pudding powder? It wasn't instant like today, It was pudding powder that you had to boil the milk and stuff like that. So she said, well, we'll figure out a way. So she went and got, I don't know where she got them. She got a few little containers, and metal containers. And what we did, we put water in and put that coffee powder in and started stirring. Well, that was all good. You stirred all you want. All you did is make lumps. And she said, okay. we hit them and left. And about 4 days later, we came back to the same area, and we looked at those things, and we stirred them again. And lo and behold, they start taking a little bit. And it ended up like, you remember when you were teenage girls and you first make mashed potatoes? You know, that's about what it turned out to be, all lumpy. But hey, it was a great addition to our diet. So we filled the containers again and left them there, and then when we went to another area, we found some containers there, and we filled them. And we had a great invention there. But anyway, we lived like that for about 2 years. And then one night we made a mistake. It had been again raining, we were cold, and actually we were hungry. And we finally found a barn. And when we went up the stairs, there was straw laying right there by the stair, and we just conked out there. And the following morning, I'm a light sleeper. I was then, I am now. I heard an unfamiliar noise first thing in the morning. And I jumped up. Now, the way those barns were, picture that one there, except, about the size of this building. And at one end, away from the stairwell, there was a set of doors that opened up to nowhere. And over that was a beam sticking out with a hook on it where they could put a hoist and haul things up to the second floor. I opened up the door and I looked out, and there were 3 trucks, military trucks. And they were coming straight for us. So I turned around and got to my sister, and I told her, I said, the Germans are coming, let's get out of here. So we got up, and about halfway down the stairs, I turned back and hollered at the rest of them, that the Germans were coming. I wanted to make sure we were the first ones out. So we got out, and we started running. I don't know where you're going to go. So we ran, and my sister was running a little bit behind me. And then I heard gunshots. And I looked to talk to my sister, and she was no longer there. But I kept running. And then I remember running between 2 buildings, a narrow space between 2 buildings. And all of a sudden I heard a gunshot and a pain in my right leg. And I went down. And I laid there for a minute, and I looked at it, and it was just a little bit of blood, but not much. And the reason I could see, because in Holland, at the time, boys under age 14 did not wear long pants. You wore shorts. I remember very well in the wintertime, my mom got me ready to go to school. She put a flannel shirt on me, a wool shawl, and a jacket, wool mittens, and a wool cap, and shorts. Made good sense. But anyway, I looked at that, and I didn't have much pain, so I decided to get up and run again. And as I got up, I looked straight into the barrel of a rifle. And one of the German soldiers had me, so I decided I better do what he tells me to. So he took me to where the trucks were and loaded me into the truck. And then the gunfire stopped. And of course, my big concern was, where's my sister? So we stood there for a while. They got a few more people in, and then they hauled us off. And in Holland, there were 2 places that they took it. The biggest one was Westerlo, and that's where the Frank family went. And from there, twice a week, they had to train transport to Auschwitz. On the other one, further away from us, was a smaller one called Vught. And that was a combination processing camp and concentration camp. They had political prisoners in there, Dutch political prisoners. And we went there, and on that place on Vught, once a week, they hauled people out by train. And from what I could find out, that we were headed for Mauthausen. And so the day we were supposed to go, that was within a week after I got there, just a few days really, they took us to the platform, and and then the train was on my right. And I looked between the cars, and there was another platform and another train. And on that platform was nothing but women. And I kept looking, and lo and behold, all of a sudden I saw my sister. And I was so overcome with joy that I jumped up and hollered at her, but she didn't hear me. And before I could try something else, the guard hit me in the back with the butt of his rifle. So I went down again. But anyway, I knew my sister was alive. I was full of joy. They loaded us in those cattle cars, and they tight enough, that it was hard to breathe. I know I was standing behind a man who was kind of a big guy, his shoulders like that, and my nose was pushed right into his shoulder blade. And then I heard the train on the other platform leave. And we stood there for about another hour or so, and then our train moved. Well, after the war, I found out what had happened when we got ready to go to Mauthausen. They found out that the Allies had bombed the railhead going into Mauthausen, so we couldn't get in there. They took the train that my sister was on and rode it further south. After it had already left, they told them to turn farther south, and she ended up at one of the oldest camps. What was that camp in Munich? Okay. Dachau, yeah. My sister ended up in Dachau. Also found out that the message took our train and says to take it to Bergen-Belsen. But there was a second part to the message. It dropped the last two carloads off at Papenburg. Papenburg was a camp, a slave labor camp, about 15 miles short of Bergen-Belsen. I was in the next to the last car. So if I had been in any other car, there'd be most likely somebody else sitting here, not me. But fortunately, I went to Papenburg. Papenburg was bad enough. We got there at night, and then it actually was 3 different camps under one command. And I was in the largest of the 3 camps called Westerwege. And things were very harsh there. They dropped me off in the barracks, locked the door behind me, and I sat there all night by that door. And I don't know whether I cried or not, but most likely did. And I was worried about my sister again. I was now all by myself. At the time, I was 13 years old. And I thought, why am I here? What have I done that is so bad that deserves this? And there were no answers. So early in the morning, the whistle blew, the door opened up, and everybody ran outside. They had roll call, and they marched people off to work. Primarily, the work consisted, they had a shipbuilding company there, a large one. They used slave labor there. And after, back in 85, I think it was, my wife and I took a tour of Alaska. And the ship we were on was built in Papenburg. And I talked to one of the officers, and he said, well, there'll be 2 more being built at Papenburg, the same shipyard that used to make German warships. They also had 2 car manufacturing plants. One of them was owned by Mercedes, and the other one by General Motors. So they used slave labor there. Most of my days were spent out in the field where they had people digging holes, making stuff like pieces this big of peat. The land was not usable because of the peat. And I found out what Hitler's plan was, is to dig down about 6 feet across, fill it in with regular soil, and make farmland out of it. And when they dug those out, they stacked them up alternately so they could dry. And the pieces that were dry were used for fuel, turf. and that's what most of I did. The biggest killer in the camp actually was dysentery. The food we got and stuff like that were other diseases, but I know the barracks I was put in, it had almost 60 people in it. By the time we were liberated, only 5 of those 60 people were still alive. Others had been replenished, and some of those had died. If you got to the point that you couldn't work anymore, they ship you up down the road to the Bergen-Belsen. But every morning they had a cart. When they had the roll call and somebody didn't know answer the roll, they had a couple of prisoners go into barracks, and if somebody died during the night, they bring them out and they put them in a push cart, and they haul them off. I don't know what they did with them. You didn't ask questions like that. And I know in other camps like Bergen-Belsen, they just stacked them between the barracks. In other camps, they hauled them off in the woods and dumped them. So that went on and on. Our food was concerned. In the mornings, there were no breakfast. And out in the field, about lunchtime or a little bit before, they had a lady or a girl come out with a basket and brought us a slice of dark, sour rye bread. And it was heavily coated with lard. And they handed us a slice of that. There were plenty of water puddles in the field to get water. You didn't die of thirst. And there again, I was lucky. But at times, I was on a detail, and I was primarily on a detail with elderly men. They had just a few young kids like me, and they had elderly men there, and quite often among them was a very Orthodox Jew, and he looked at that and he said, no, he couldn't eat the lard. Well, you got nothing else. Now, I brought that up with several rabbis, including Orthodox rabbis, and they said under the circumstances, it would have been perfectly all right for them to eat that. But they didn't. Well, what girl did? They didn't eat that kind of stuff. So she handed that extra piece of bread to one of the other prisoners. And since I was usually the only kid in the detail, I ended up with an extra slice of bread. And I got one about twice a week. I got an extra slice of bread, and that was a lot. But anyway, it went on, and then we started the effects of the war. Planes coming over. And what it was, when they started 24-hour bombing, they had the northern route and the southern route to Berlin. And one of them came over our camp. So we saw a trove of bombers coming, including these type, And so we know the war wasn't going like the Germans were telling us, like at roll call. They told us how many British ships they sank and stuff like that. And then we knew that the planes over were Allied because the Germans were shooting at them. And one of these got shot down just outside of our camp. It was in the wintertime of 1944, and when it hit the ground, it was solid ice that it hit, so it just destroyed it. But and then one day we were out for for roll call, and we could hear gunfire, a muffled gunfire sound. Well, one of the guys in our barracks had been a French artillery officer. And he said, what we hear is mortars. If so, he said, they were within a mile and a half of us. So we felt good about that. And then a couple of days later, we went out there, and all of a sudden we saw a tank on the street in front of the camp. And we were full of joy, and then all of a sudden we heard a gunshot, and the top of the tank blew off. 88 down the road, I just zeroed in on that tank. But a couple of days later, before roll call, I woke up and all of the guys were at the window looking out the window. So I went over there and tried to look out the window, and they pushed me aside. They never let me participate in anything. But then all of a sudden, they all ran to the door and started banging the door. And I went to the window, and a tank had come through the gate. Now, I had no idea who they were, but it had no German markings on it. So I knew it wasn't a German tank. And then I saw soldiers coming from behind the tank. And then our guys bust the door down, and they ran outside, and those soldiers all went back behind the tank. And I said, oh my gosh, they're afraid of us. Well, what I found out later, because the guys came back out, and they wore a handkerchief around their nose, some of them wearing gas masks, because when these guys came out of the barracks, we had, dysentery was widespread. And you couldn't get out during the night. We never had a shower, never had a change of clothes. So you can imagine what we smelt like. And when that hit those guys, they wanted to. But anyway, they came back around and we were liberated. That tank turned out to be a KW-85, a British tank. And they started immediately working with us. The first thing they did, they gave us a biscuit about that big around, and I bit on it, and that thing was as hard as a rock. And they did that on purpose, because from the earlier camps, these good soldiers, included especially the Americans, when these hungry skeletons asked for something to eat, guess what they gave them? Hershey bars. Killed hundreds of them. They hadn't had a decent anything to eat for years, and all of a sudden they get something as rich as a Hershey bar. But anyway, they knew better by then, and they gave us that. So it took me an hour and a half to eat that biscuit. And then they took our clothing off. They gave us odds and ends clothing to wear, and burned them. And that was because of typhus. We didn't have typhus, but typhus was caused by lice, and we had lice, but no typhus. And so they did that, and then they sprayed us with a white powder to kill the lice. Well, later they found out that powder was just as effective as killing people as it was killing lice, so they internationally outlawed DDT. But that's what they sprayed us with, is DDT. But it didn't kill me. And then they started taking a truckload out at a time and hauling people out. I didn't go on the first truckload, but I went late that night. Some guys had to stay in that camp another 3 days because they could only process so many at a time. And in town, they had taken a school in the town of Papenburg and made it into a dispensary. And then they put a placard on us, with a piece of twine, and made all kinds of notations on there. And they took us from station to station. And we got to one station where the nurse took our blood pressure and listened to our heart. And lo and behold, she was from Holland. The first time I could speak to somebody in a language I knew. And I talked to her, and she told me how things were in Holland and stuff like that. And after that, every minute I had, I went over to my nurse and talked to her. And I was there for about, I think about 9 days. I'm not for sure. My memory is getting kind of bad, especially last January I had my second stroke. And since there, things haven't been that great. But anyway, after that many days, I got to her, and she weighed me and took my blood pressure and everything. She said, how would you like to go home? I said, that's what I've been waiting for. And she said, well, you're in great shape. You gained 17 pounds since you've been here. I said, great, how much do I weigh? She said, you're all the way up to 96 pounds. So anyway, they trucked us to Holland, and there I found my mom had survived, and she didn't want to tell much what they went through. But, you know, it was horrible. They ate things that I didn't have to eat. And so, but that was a hard time for her because she kept running to the railroad station, the bus station, to see anybody coming back knew anything about any of the rest of the family. Well, after about 3 weeks, an ambulance pulled up and brought my sister from Dachau. She was in terrible shape. She'd been beaten severely, and she couldn't walk. And they brought her in, and we babied her and helped her. And after a few months, maybe 6, 7 months, Mom talked to us and she said, you know, nobody else is coming back. And there are just too many empty chairs here. So I think we should put in for migration to another country and start a second life. And so she did. She put in for the United States, New Zealand, South Africa, Australia, and Canada. And the first response we got was from New Zealand. They said they'd take us. But then before we agreed to that, there came the United States would accept us. Well, Mom's brother, her younger brother, had migrated to the United States way before. So we had some relative that lived in the United States. And so we switched and took the application to the United States. But it still took a few years to get a passport, you know, to get a visa. And so when we did in 1950, January of 1950, we boarded the steamer called the Veendam. All the Dutch steamers were named after towns, and we came to the United States. On board, Mom got us together, and she says, now we have an opportunity to start a new life. So let's forget about the past. Don't talk about it, forget about it. We promised we'd do that. So we got to the United States and moved in with my uncle, and then we got a little apartment of our own. And the first job I got, one of the neighbors was involved in the gas station business. He says, we're opening a new gas station, the largest gas station in the United States. He said, we need help for the weekend, you know, the grand opening. I said, hey, you know, and I turned 19 aboard the ship. And so I went to work at that gas station, but I found out I couldn't pump gas because I couldn't speak English. I didn't speak a word of English. So they had me wipe windshields. And but I do remember on the pumps, the price of the gas was 18.4 cents a gallon. And some people didn't have enough money to fill up the tank. But anyway, I worked there for 3 days. And then shortly thereafter, I got an envelope in the mail. And it looked really official, but I couldn't read English. But my landlord had been stationed in Germany right after the war. And he spoke German, and I could understand some German, so I took it to him. So he opened it up and read it and started laughing. I said, what's so funny? He said, you've been drafted. So I was drafted in the Army. I still didn't speak English. And I remember going to South Carolina for basic training. And after that, I started gaining weight. And then I got to the point after I went through my biggest thrill was to stand in front of a pantry, open it up, and see all that food. So when there was plenty of food to eat, I just overate. So I talked to my mom on the phone, and I said, Mom, I lost 15 pounds. She said, you did what? I said, I lost 15 pounds. She said, you're sick. I said, no, Mom, I'm not on a diet. She said, you did what? I said, I went on a diet. And there was a little silence, and then she said, that's just like you. For years, you almost starved to death. Then the good Lord takes you clear across the ocean where there was plenty, and now you refuse to eat. So that was the end of my diet. I served my 2 years in the Army, and but after basic training, orders came for our group to go to Germany. I broke out in a cold sweat. So I went to see my first sergeant and then my commander, and I told them why I was afraid to go to Germany. So they sent me to a psychologist, and that lady was one of the biggest helps I ever had since I've been here. She talked to me, and then she took me to the regimental commander. And she said, sir, I don't want to tell you what to do, but I don't think it's a good idea to send this guy to Germany with a loaded rifle. So they sent me to Korea instead. But anyway, she talked to me after it, and she said, you know, you got to change your life. You got to quit hating. She said, your hatred towards the Germans made Hitler the winner. Even though he didn't get your life, he got your soul. He said, so quit. And you know, that was the best advice I ever had. So, except maybe for one, when I came to the United States, we were met on the dock by a representative of the Dutch consulate. And the reason I always remember, the guy had been an international soccer player, played on the Dutch national team, which, you know, to a Dutch boy, that was a big thing. You know, that was like you meeting Mickey Mantle. So, and he told us on the dock, he says, I have a message for you from the Queen. He said, the people of the United States welcome you with open arms, with open hearts. He said, no, what the Queen wants you to do is become Americans. Not American Dutchmen, not Dutch Americans, become Americans. Learn the language, learn the customs, and above all, don't complain. He said, if you're not willing to do that, she wants you to get back on the boat. And I think that's a message that all immigrants should hear. After I got out of the Army, I tried to go back to school, and that didn't work out too well. So I went in the Air Force, and I served a combination of 25 years. And the reason I came here today, because not known to me, one of the people that volunteers here, he's back there. His name is David Streeter, and I was stationed here at Davis Mountain, and for a little period of time, he was my squadron commander. And he traced me down, and I was his first sergeant, and we were not like commander and first sergeant. We became buddies. We became friends, and we still are. But I hadn't seen him in ages, but he tracked me down with the help of some other people, including Sharon Glassberg. He tracked me down, and he offered to come here. Now, I'm used to speaking to kids, but I'm going to tell you what the tutor told to tell the kids at the end. And I want you to tell your kids and your grandkids. You know, I married an American girl, and in '83, we went on a trip to Europe. I wanted to feel, just how well I could do. On the train in Germany, the trainmen wore the same uniform they wore during World War II. And we were in our cabin, and I noticed outside, looking out the window, was a trainman in uniform. So I went out there and I talked to him, and I had absolutely no trouble. So I felt real good. And but I have 5 grandkids and 11 great grandkids. I have 3 sons, 10 of them are my drivers and stuff like that. They take me places. And but what I tell the kids that what happened to us is not your fault, and there's nothing you can do to rectify it. But what you can do is stop it from happening again. And the first thing you got to think about, what is causing all this trouble? And it's prejudice. You know, when you meet people that teach that garbage, that one tribe is better than the other, you know, one religion is better than the other, get away from it, because it's contagious. And better yet, tell them you don't want any part of what they believe in. And then maybe someday, my great-great-grandchildren and your grandchildren can grow up in peace and harmony. Again, thank you for being here, and thanks, David.
Are you willing to take some questions?
Oh, yeah, whatever you want.
Yeah. So Andrew's happy to take some questions. Before you raise your hand, I want to also thank a couple of my team members who really helped today with creating and producing this event. Alex Chambers is around here somewhere, Gail Thompson, and Dan Petricelli in the back. We have a very small staff, small number of volunteers. We couldn't have done it without these 3 plus David's involvement. So thank you guys as well. So what I'd like to do, I know we have kind of a noisy hangar environment, so if you have a question, let's try raise your hand. And do you want to point to who gets answered?
Sure, okay.
And if you can talk very loudly, and if not, I'll come to you with the mic. So who has a question for Andrew?
Maybe I did a good enough job. They don't have a passion.
So, sir, when you went with your sister, your mom stayed in that attic with the other family members? So your mom stayed with the other family members there?
Yeah,
She stayed there the whole time?
yes.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, that's, you know, I didn't talk about the Franks. His place of business was right across the street from where my grandma lived, but we were living with her at the end. And they kicked all the Jews kids out of public schools. They took one small school, and I don't remember the real name of it, but it was known, referred to as the Jew school. And that's where we went to school. And that's where I really met the Frank girls. Because sometimes after school, they, instead of going home, they'd go to the dad's place and go home with him. Well, his dad, like I said, was right across. So we had about a half dozen of us walk together from school. I met Hank, I met her sister, I met their dad. I didn't particularly have any feelings towards Ann because she was a tomboy. She was a year and a half older than me, but her older sister was a real nice lady. So we walked together and talked, but like I said, she wasn't famous at the time. like most artists, they have to die to become famous.
Other questions?
How many other folks, sorry, I'm usually pretty loud too. How many other folks did you and your sister meet in the fields? You know, were they traveling individually, in small families?
Yeah, most of them were in very small groups, like 2 or 3. And I would say maybe totally we met 25 people that were hiding in the same way we were.
In the camp that you were, was it ever, there's an estimate of how many people, including yourself, survived? What percentage?
How many people survived from your camp?
The estimate the only thing I could find after the war, they said that over about 82% of the people that entered Papenburg died there. But they died of malnutrition and the disease. They had some excuse, if somebody got really mad at, one of the guards, they'd use a pistol shot to the head. I know after we were liberated by the British, because the second biscuit they gave us that night, they accompanied with a little cup of warm tea. That was a dead giveaway. I finally knew who these guys were. Only the British carried tea into combat. It was horrible. Like I said, starvation and stuff like that. When we were liberated, the British, what the problem they had learned is to protect the guards and the command, from the rest, the prisoners retaliating. And they had that problem in our camp. But before they could stop it, some of the prisoners had broken into the administrative building where the officers were hiding, and they brought out the commander. And the commander wore one of the little daggers that you may have seen in some of the movies. And his habit was, he was a herding man. Most of the guards were injured in combat and came there. And he was one of them. He had lost an arm in a lake. And he was an angry man, and most likely in pain. And he liked to take that dagger and carve on people. So what they did, they drug him out in the field outside the barracks, and they killed him with his own dagger. But that's the only retribution that I saw.
Other questions?
You mentioned that when you were out in the fields, you would be with the farmers. What was the general feeling of sympathy that you got from your fellow Hollanders while you were in hiding? I know you probably you tried to limit the amount of contact you had with other people before being discovered, but did you get a sense that you became a pariah, or did you get sympathy from your fellow countrymen?
We were fortunate to be in Holland, because the sympathy from the people, if you go to Eastern Germany, you talk to some of the people, the Polish and Hungarians and stuff like that. In Holland, the Jews had much more sympathy, but they were others. They had a Dutch Nazi party, the NSB, and so there was a percentage, but overall, I never know how they came to find us, but what we found out, that the guys that we found in that attic with us had been there for over 2 weeks. And that was the dumbest thing to do. You didn't do that. Somebody is finally going to turn you in. That's the same in Anne Frank. That was the book says they don't know who did turn them in. With the people that lived at that time, they knew who did it. In the book and in the movie, you hear about the handyman building that entry to the attic. His son was helping him. He knew what was going on, and then they had a noise downstairs. Well, they were upstairs, and one of the men went downstairs, and there was nobody there. But they found out later that was the son of the carpenter, and he knew there was money down there, and he couldn't find it. And when he couldn't find it, he called the cops and turned him in. But he was never, he was charged but not found guilty because they couldn't prove it was him. But overall, the Dutch were much more sympathetic towards the Jews than most other countries.
Yes, sir. Your sister that you loved so much, how well did she recover from her internment?
Not very well. She had 11 spinal surgeries, but that was most not to fix her, but to kill the pain. She had to wear a brace across the shoulder all the way to above her knees. Of course, she couldn't have any children, but fortunately, she married another survivor, and his sister was pregnant and lived in an apartment complex, and one of the neighbors told him, when you have the baby, don't have it in your place. Come over and have it in my place. Leave the baby with me. Come and feed the baby and do whatever you want, but don't take it into your apartment. So they came and took her and her husband away, and they didn't survive. The baby did. So my sister and her husband adopted that child. And even though my sister couldn't have any children, that girl had 11. So my sister didn't have any. And yeah, she was my idol, but she died at age 98. And so she was in pain constantly, and she was limited in what she could do, but she survived well enough to come to the United States. To take special permission for her to pass the physical, you know. She made it with us.
Other questions?
Did you encounter any guards in the concentration camp that were sympathetic to the prisoners?
Absolutely not. Like I said, most of our guards were SS members that had been in combat and had some kind of disability because of it, you know, missing arm, missing foot, or something like that. They, in my opinion, they were a bunch of angry men, and they used any excuse to hurt you. And you know, people, I've read books, you know, how they had organizations of prisoners within and stuff like that. Not from my experience, because even the prisoners, like in my case, if a soldier, a guard, hurt me, if they'd step in, they'd get killed. So, you know, there was no real camaraderie among the prisoners. Each of them just tried to survive. They weren't, you know, they were friendly to one another, but you knew from the beginning you were on your own.
Thank you for educating us. You mentioned that you are going into schools and speaking with students. Is there a typical question that students are asking you that you can share with us?
Yeah. Very few places I've been with kids, the first question was always, have you ever met Hitler? Now, but the kids more ask me about Anne Frank than they do about anything else. I know Anne Frank is not a way to teach the Holocaust. but when you go among kids, it's sure an attention getter. And just the fact that I knew Anne Frank will bring kids come to the lecture.
Yeah, in your travels, have you met any Nazis or met any Germans from the war? And if so, what was your interactions like?
Well, I remember one. My oldest son and I were doing a job in one of the subdivisions, and one of the residents there, he would go shower at the swimming pool rather than use water in his apartment. You know? And one time we were in there, and he came out of there with just shorts on, and he rubbed his head, and I noticed in his armpit was a letter. The SS had their blood type put onto their armpits. And I saw that, and I went to him. I said, "Where did you get that?" And he told me I was an SS officer. And so I called a friend of mine, a lawyer. I said, "I got turned into an SS officer. What am I going to do?" So I gave him his name, and he called me back. And he said he called immigration. They said he cleared immigration. But I've met a few people, you know, like that were regular soldiers, and they said too, you know, "Hey, I was drafted. What could I do?" Yeah.
You came to America because you had a brother here?
You know,
Uncle. The uncle.
An uncle?
Yeah.
Did you live in the same place? Have you lived different places in America?
Oh yeah. Well, I was sponsored by a farmer in Wyoming that my uncle got for us. And when we came here, we went to my uncle. But within days, my mom and I and my sister, we got an apartment. And then I was drafted. I spent the last 8.5 years of my career here at Davis Mountain. And so we had the house, we raised our family here. And so when I retired, we stayed right here.
His story that he tells now is quite interesting. And the story that he doesn't tell to us is cherished. There's so many things that he did. He was a boxer. He was a wrestler, professional. He was a member of the Boy Scouts in Holland, in the United States. And even when we got too old to be in the Boy Scouts, he stayed with them. There's just so many other stories that I'm still experiencing when I take him to breakfast every Sunday because he makes me drive. And I hear these stories that he tells, and it's like, oh, let me get my phone. I got to turn the tape recorder on, and then he goes, "Okay, I'm done. Thanks." You know. But he's a treasure to us, to our family, and to other people that he meets. I tell people he's a great guy. He'll walk into a room of 20 people and leave with 21 friends. He's just that kind of guy. So am I back in the will?
You're trying to make me cry, don't you?
I'm just curious what you do in the Air Force.
From the beginning, I went to school in the missiles, and I was in the original drone squadron. You know, the U.S. military experimented with drones in as early as 1928. They used old fighters to put a radio in it. But in the 50s, they were still using the pole batter for fighters to shoot at. But that was getting so dangerous, you know, because instead of using guns, they were using missiles. That in the early 50s, Ryan Aeronautical Company was given a contract to build a jet-propelled drone. And in the first place it was stationed, the drone squadron was in Yuma. And that's where we received the first drones. And then we moved to Tyndall Air Force Base, Florida. And after that, they moved us here to Davis Monthan. And that's where Streeter was my commander. And I ended up as the first sergeant in the squadron.
I'm curious to know if you found contact with anybody you knew in the camps post-release.
No.
Hello, my name is Daisy. I want to first thank you so much for being here. I wanted to assure you that I'm 28 years old. I'm Jewish. I served in the Israeli military, and your story will be passed down to my kids and my grandkids. And I've dedicated my life to putting more good into the world than there was when I came into it. I'm studying to be a social worker, and I want you to know I will do everything in my power to make this world a better place. I don't have a question. I just wanted you to know that.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
I'd like to point out that today we're also honored to have 2 other Holocaust survivors.
One of them is from Holland.
In addition to these 3 very resilient individuals, we have a 4th who flew aboard these. Walter Ram is a volunteer here at our museum. He passed the century mark back in December. He comes in every Monday to this museum, takes questions. He was shot down on the 6th mission, so he too became a unwilling guest of the German Third Reich, just like these folks here did, but in a different capacity. So let's give a round of applause for him. Other questions?
So when you were in the process of immigrating to America, how did you correspond with your family over here? Did you correspond through letters or through telephone?
My relatives in the United States?
Yeah.
By letter. Yeah.
So I'm a high school history teacher, and I've seen it kind of pop up more and more as stories like yours kind of fade into history a little bit and become less common. And it kind of breaks my heart every time a kid will say something like it, and I'm sure we've all seen it. What are your thoughts on the growth of the Holocaust denial movement?
What do you think of the growth of the Holocaust denial?
Well, you know, the Holocaust is actually one of the most documented events in history. You know, the Germans were very thorough. They recorded it all. You know, they took pictures of the executions and everything. One of the saddest things that happened after the war, the Allies decided, well, let's make a movie of all the facts in a movie style that everybody can see. So they hired Alfred Hitchcock to produce it, and he did. He worked on it for 3 years. But when he finished it, the British banned it and ordered it destroyed. So nobody in the public has ever seen that movie. But he took German records, not some made German records. Pictures of the Germans shooting the Jews, you know, like line them up on a ditch and shooting them up in a ditch and just cover them up. But he had the whole story, and but it never got publicized. But to deny it, you know, even you can go on the internet and get all the facts of the Holocaust.
Other questions?
Have you recorded your experiences with Spielberg's Schot program?
Yeah. You're a member of the Schot program. He asked about that.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I was one of the early ones that they interviewed, but and Steven Spielberg was still running it. Yeah.
Hey, one last question.
I was just going to add something. Arizona Public Media recently did interviews with 18 of our Holocaust survivors, and they're all available on the Arizona Public Media website, all free of charge to use for school, for students, and it's an amazing resource.
I think just out of respect of everyone's time, we'll go ahead and wrap it up. If we could have one more round of applause for Andrew, the other survivors, the local